This is the first in a series of recordings concerning web services. This tutorial is called Creating a Web Services Provider. In this tutorial, we will take an integration server flow service and expose it as a web service with its corresponding WSDL file. We will then take that WSDL file and use that to execute the flow service from outside of integration server using a web service client, SOAP-based client tool. You will notice that I'm in the Web Methods Eclipse-based development environment called Designer. And you'll also notice I am in the service development perspective. Within the service development perspective, you can see there is a series of packages. There is also happens to be a package called Tutorials, and underneath Tutorials there is a series of folders. Underneath the Adapters folder is a JDBC adapter service, which will go out to a relational database and select a specific customer by ID from the customer table. There is also an integration server flow service which executes the JDBC adapter service. If we will go in and take a look at this, and you can see the input and output signature of get customer by ID. You'll notice that the input is customer ID and the output is a document called customer. Now we will take our integration server flow service called get customer by ID and expose this as a web service by creating a web service provider. Underneath the web services folder, there's a folder called providers. This is where we wish to create our web service provider. I'm going to right mouse button on the provider folder and select the option new and select web service descriptor. This launches the create web service descriptor wizard. The first step is to provide a name. We'll call this get cust web service provider and click next. At this point, we're going to select the option to create a provider and to use an existing IS service. We'll click next again, and at this point we navigate to the folder that contains the integration server service which we wish to expose as a web service. In this case, it's get customer by ID. At this point, we could select multiple integration server services, and within a single WSDL file, there'll be multiple WSDL operations, one corresponding to every integration server flow service we've selected. At this point, we click next to select our and specify our binder settings. In this case, we will take all the default values. We can select which version of SOAP we wish to use, which transport, what style for the operation, and whether or not we wish to enforce WSI basic profile. At this point, we click finish. And now we have a web service provider created. You can see that we have a WSDL file. The input for this particular WSDL is customer ID, and the document for output is the customer document with all of its requisite fields. And then underneath the operation, you can see our operation is get customer WS provider and get customer by ID. Now that we have our WSDL file, we can go back to the operations tab and look at the properties for this particular web service provider. You'll notice that there is a URL provided under properties for this web service provider. I'm going to take that WSDL URL and copy it to the clipboard and then launch a third-party tool called SOAP UI and add a new WSDL to a project that I've created called Web Service Tutorial Project. We're going to add the new WSDL and paste the WSDL URL into the WSDL location. Click OK. At this point, SOAP UI navigated to the location of the WSDL file and returned it, and you'll notice there's one operation under get customer by ID. It's called request 1. If I double click that, you'll notice we have a window in which we can execute and call our web service provider. Our web service provider expects the customer ID, and we can go ahead and execute this now and call our web service provider. You'll notice that this invocation failed because proper credentials were not provided. You'll notice here that access to our web service provider was denied. At this point within SOAP UI, we can add credentials to the header. So at this point, I'm going to provide login credentials, providing a proper user ID and password, and invoke our web service again. You'll notice that this time the web service worked and our customer document has been returned in the reply window of SOAP UI. This has been creating a web service provider.